This is the story of American freedom. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the greatest leader in the world today. He was a true hero. He died for his country just as surely as any soldier on the field of battle. He literally worked himself to death in the service of his country. So spoke Robert Taft, longtime Republican opponent of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died on April the 12th, 1945, in his beloved Warm Springs. But he had sought and won that fourth term. He knew he was dying, but he had to achieve one more great goal, and that was a United Nations. He kept two signed photographs on his desk. One was from Theodore Roosevelt, one was from Woodrow Wilson. He had been with Wilson in Paris, and he had shared his hero's broken heart when the League of Nations was rejected by the Senate. He was determined, Franklin Roosevelt was, that this time the United States would take the lead in an international organization that would prevent forever another disastrous world war. The new presidency fell upon Harry Truman, and he would be true to those ideals and true to the ideals of Roosevelt, that the war had been fought for democracy. Again, don't let anybody tell you that this is, quote, a republic, not a democracy. We were fighting as the democracies against the tyranny of Hitler. And in a very touching way, Roosevelt's vision was carried out in a series of images by Norman Rockwell, the famous painter and illustrator of the day. Freedom to say what you want, freedom to worship as you choose, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. In other words, every child in the world should have a good dinner waiting for him at home or her. Every child in the world and every grown-up in the world should live free not only of terror of being taken away in the middle of the night, but of simply losing a job, of no longer being able to care for his family. So that is why the war was fought. And it was hoped that this new United Nations would enable a spirit of cooperation to exist among the great powers and rebuild Europe. Wasn't to be. Already from the early days of the alliance between the Soviet Union and the British and Americans, grave suspicions arose. There are very good reasons not to start a second front immediately, but Joseph Stalin thought that the only reason was that more Russians would die, more Soviet citizens be killed, the Allies could gain more territory. By 1945, these had hardened, and the Cold War had begun. This time, the new element in freedom for America, in its story of freedom, was communism versus democracy. And communism was the great evil, just as evil as Hitler had been, based upon totalitarian governments and it must be the task of America to take up the struggle against communism. Joseph Stalin thought there was a great deal of logic on his part. He had liberated, his Soviet armies had liberated nations like Romania and Bulgaria, where they were welcomed, and they had imposed upon them the same kind of government the Soviet Union had. The same way that the Americans had liberated France and imposed upon it their idea of democracy. And yes, the Soviet Union must be safe from another invasion. And thus other countries had to be added to this Soviet empire, like Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, whether they wanted to be part of it or not. They simply threw the president of the Czech Republic out the window, literally, and imposed a Soviet-style government. But to them, communism was freedom, the great collective freedom of the worker and the peasant. By 1946, Harry Truman, by 1946, Winston Churchill had come to this country and at Fulton, Missouri, warned of an iron curtain falling across Europe, a division of Europe into freedom versus communism. And then, in 1947, Harry Truman put forth his great plan to revitalize and save Europe from communism. It was his idea, but he was already so controversial that he had it put forth in a speech delivered by his Secretary of State, George Marshall, at a Harvard commencement exercise. It was that the United States was prepared to pour billions and billions of dollars into the devastated countries of Germany and of France, of Europe as a whole, even extending the offer to the Soviets and their satellite states. They, of course, rejected it. And the United States stood forth as one of the most magnanimous, the most magnanimous country in the whole history of the world to rebuild these two evil nations, Japan and Germany, that had waged such total war upon the world, brought such misery to the world. Not only to rebuild them, but to establish in them democracies. That is one of the great achievements. To take Japan, which had never known democracy, and turn it into a functioning, viable democracy as it remains today. To re-educate the Japanese, to re-educate the Germans, and to establish Germany as a great democracy bound in ties to the United States. But the Cold War was bitter and it was harsh. The United States, to protect Europe from the spread of communism, led in the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, binding these countries together into an alliance to resist Soviet aggression against any one of them. But then, by 1949, China had become a communist country. The long civil war that had ravaged that land for years ended in a complete triumph of Mao Zedong and his Red Army. The administration of Harry Truman is a complex one, but one fact stands out. In 1945, the United States found itself in a position to establish world peace and democracy. It had the best equipped, largest army in history, fully able to challenge the Soviet army. It was rolling aircraft, tanks off the assembly lines in record numbers. But above all, it had sole control of the atomic bomb. For the American people and their unity, in 2 years, had solved the problem of taking the atom and splitting it and turning it into a mighty force. What could be a mighty force for good, for producing electricity, energy, and it could be a force that would destroy forever the human race. There was no question that the Americans were going to use this atomic bomb. It had cost $2 billion. The Americans were suffering devastating losses as they moved forward in the Pacific in battles like Okinawa. It was estimated by the military experts that America would suffer perhaps 1 million casualties in attempting to conquer the Japanese home islands. Could you really turn to the American people and say, we built a bomb at the cost of $2 billion, and then we let 1 million of your sons be killed and wounded? No. The Japanese had started this war, and as Harry Truman promised them, we will rain down upon you a destruction of fire such as never been seen in the world's history. So the Americans used it, and now they had sole control. But step by step, Stalin tested the mettle of the United States. In his memoirs, Harry Truman explains that his chief goals were, 1, to prevent another world war, and hopefully to keep the atomic bomb from spreading. Well, he certainly succeeded in the first. We have not had another world war, but he did not keep the atomic bomb from spreading. Already at Los Alamos, during the building of the bomb, the scientific community was honeycombed with communists. Stalin was not surprised at Potsdam when Truman told him of this new weapon. He had known about it. And by 1949, the Soviets exploded their own bomb. They had tested the United States by overthrowing the government of Czechoslovakia. They tested the United States by blockading Berlin. The Americans responded by the airlift bringing in food. And then in 1950, Stalin challenged the United States in a more dramatic fashion. In 1950, North Korean troops crossed into South Korea. And suddenly, an unbelieving American people found themselves back in another shooting war, and one that they were losing. General MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific Campaign, proved himself, get mad at me if you want to, but the one job of a general is to win, and he lost. His Incheon invasion was brilliant, but he violated the most basic of military maxims by splitting his forces, by refusing to listen to intelligence that said that the Chinese were gathering on the borders. And American troops finally lost 56,000 men there in the freezing, bitter cold of Korea to achieve nothing more than a stalemate that left things just as they had been in 1950. A war for the Soviet Union by proxy. a war by the United States with the blood of its finest young men. Many of them not even eligible to vote or to take a drink, but eligible to die for their country. Thus the Cold War continued to harden. The death of Stalin in 1953 brought no change in the attitude of the Soviet Union or in the attitude of the United States. Both used their nuclear power to create a terrifying arsenal of weapons, able to destroy the world many times over. And step by step, the march continued towards nuclear war. Children in the United States grew used to school exercises where they dived under their desk in the event of a nuclear attack. Much good that would do. These same school children wore dog tags with their name and religion on it in case they were killed in this nuclear attack. The hatreds were virulent, and it was always the same. The Americans were the colonialist, the imperialist, the enemies of all workers and peasants all over the world. And the Soviet Union, why, that was the evil nation determined to impose godless communism upon the world. The teachings of Karl Marx were even banned from many schools in America, lest somehow Americans might become infected with this intellectual disease. The State Department was suspected, in some cases rightly, of being honeycombed with communist sympathizers. Senators rose up in their august chamber to denounce the communists that were honeycombing the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. That good and great man, Dwight Eisenhower, whenever I hold up to my students an example of what they can achieve, I give them Dwight Eisenhower. Born poor, visit the little house where he grew up in Abilene, Kansas, going to West Point because that's the only school he could afford, playing football for Army. Now, you didn't know that, did you? That's what he liked best. And losing his hair. He was already losing his hair as a young cadet. And you know, later on, after having led his country to victory in the greatest war in its history, after having been a successful two-term president, the thing he was most proud of was tackling Jim Thorpe single-handedly one Saturday afternoon as Army played Carlisle. A slow career in the United States Army. He once told President Roosevelt that he had spent 5 years studying drama under Douglas MacArthur. But he was the man to lead the Allied forces. They didn't need a George Patton. They needed a diplomat, an organizer, an administrator. And that is what he was. And that is what he was as president. The more we learn about his presidency, the more we understand that he took a very effective role in guiding that administration, in dampening one Cold War incident after another. And finally, in a farewell address that might be compared to Washington, warning the American people against the military-industrial complex. That unholy alliance of big business and the financial world and the military that would plunge this country into ever greater debt that would one day destroy this country. And seeing himself as truly the executive of this country. Even his own son never knew exactly what Dwight Eisenhower thought about segregation. But when the Supreme Court said that there could not be separate but equal schools, he enforced it. And thus, America came to 1960 and the election of John Kennedy. A bitterly contested election. The Democrats building upon what was perhaps a totally mythical concept of a missile gap. All decided really in the debates. The first time that these shows, this entertainment, would become decisive in American history. Richard Nixon was a capable man, great deal of experience. Indeed, Eisenhower's heart attacks had given Nixon a good deal of experience in guiding the country. Very strongly opposed to communism, very strongly opposed to any negotiations with the Soviet Union. His opponent, John Kennedy, representing, like Nixon, that new generation of men who had fought in World War II, but handsome and debonair. And on the debates, why, there was Nixon, his little lips starting to sweat. There was no way he could control it. And Kennedy, glib on his feet, winning the American people over. Why, most of you won't appreciate this, but in Oklahoma, there was a great senator, Senator Robert Kerr. And towards the very end of the campaign process, Kennedy came to Oklahoma City, and Senator Kerr introduced him. For there was still some sentiment in this country about voting for a Catholic. And Kerr said to this audience that was very skeptical, "You know, my friends, when I go to heaven, I can go up to my daddy and say, 'Daddy, I voted for a Catholic.' And he'll embrace me. But I can never go up and say, 'Daddy, I voted for a Republican.'" And the crowd went wild. In a disputed election, disputed particularly in Illinois, where some claim that there were nefarious combinations coming together to stuff the ballot box, a practice not unheard of in Illinois or other states for that matter. Kennedy won. And on January the 20th, 1960, America stood at the high point of its moral authority. On that bitterly cold day, that youthful president was sworn in, and he proclaimed that this was a new generation of Americans, that we had been hardened in war and disciplined by a stern peace, that this generation was prepared to pay any price, to bear any burden, to ensure the survival and success of freedom. And his idealism vitalized a young generation His vision was of a new frontier, taking its place alongside Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism, Woodrow Wilson's new freedom, a new frontier where we had the scientific power to see to it that every child in the world was fed, that prosperity was brought to every country in the world, and that prosperity would come with democratic freedom, that we would see to the triumph of that democratic freedom. No matter what the cost, we would pay it. We were not afraid of the Soviet Union. We were not afraid of their nuclear missiles. We would never negotiate, he said, out of fear. But we would never fear to negotiate. We would reach out, stretch that hand to see if these weapons could not be dismantled and the world live in safety from nuclear destruction. He could be a hard man. When the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev met him in Vienna, Kennedy had seemed inexperienced and weak. The island of Cuba had become a communist nation. And in October of 1962, it was learned through American intelligence that the Soviet Union was installing missiles right there in Cuba, pointed at cities like Miami and Washington, D.C. itself. Well, from the Soviet Union's point of view, it really didn't seem all that bad. After all, we had missiles in Turkey pointed right at them. Why couldn't they have missiles pointed right at us? But Kennedy wasn't going to have it. And in a stern speech that October 1962, he turned many Americans who had doubted his leadership to understand this was one of our great presidents. He told the Soviet Union we would go to war with them, and that meant all-out nuclear war. We would first set up an embargo, but if they tried to cross that embargo, then the missiles would be unleashed. But he was a pragmatic, practical man. And while he was speaking of war, he was attempting to negotiate through backstairs negotiations, making deals, publicly get those missiles out of Cuba. And we will quietly take some of our missiles out of Turkey. But Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union had blinked. They were defeated in this. And Kennedy emerged as a more popular figure than ever. So America stood forth on November the 22nd, 1963, at the height of its moral authority. Its young people going into the Peace Corps to bring the message of democracy to countries all over the world and to help them create an educational system and an economic system that would make such democracy viable. With a nation that was strong with its missiles, respected throughout the world, and Kennedy loving his job, with his beautiful wife, looking forward to another 4 years and to expanding this new frontier, with Germany and Japan becoming ever more prosperous, Kennedy going to Berlin and pronouncing clearly, "This is the bastion of freedom. To every man and woman who loves freedom, it is a sacred city." And in those terms, I am proud to say, "Ich bin ein Berliner." But on November the 22nd, 1963, he was shot dead by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. It was a trauma from which this country would not recover for years to come. The thought that a president could be assassinated, the doubts about how that assassination had occurred, and simply the taking away of the life of a man who could have permanently changed America and the world. So the new frontier, with its vision of democracy as the successful struggle against communism, of freedom as the antithesis of communism. Something special from it seemed to disappear forever.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our freedom and heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.